All right, well, we'll begin the interview then. So, hello, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos. Today is April 26th, 2022. Who would have the pleasure with us speaking with today?
Uh, I'm Professor Francis E. Putz. Uh,
Fantastic, Dr. Putz. So if you can just begin by telling me your position and kind of how you got there.
I'm a distinguished professor of biology. I joined the faculty, University of Florida in 1982, soon after completing my PhD at Cornell. I went off to do a postdoc at Oxford, and I've been pretty much here with since then. And I didn't expect to be at a Research One university. My first degree from the University of Wisconsin was in teaching, biology education, and I thought that I would be teaching high school biology. I went into after teaching high school biology and middle school for a while, I went into the Peace Corps in Malaysia, and I was there for 3 years and got totally hooked on research and forest conservation. I've always been an environmentalist, but the research side of it was pretty new to me. I was singularly unqualified for the jobs that I was told to do in Malaysia, but I did them as well as I could. And after 3 years, I realized that I really need more education. So then I started applying to graduate schools and came back and wanted to continue doing research in Malaysia, but got funded to do research in Central America and South America. So ended up doing my PhD in Panama and Venezuela, Amazonia and Venezuela. Finally did go back to Southeast Asia and to continue the work, but that was after my PhD. So, and I've been going back and forth between Southeast Asia and Central America ever since, with some sojourns in Africa as well.
Fantastic. So if you can just if you can kind of start elaborating on, why you study forest, because and then most importantly, what forest's role is in water quality conservation and water quantity conservation.
Yeah, first of all, let me just emphasize that in Florida, emphasis on forest is misplaced, because the uplands of Florida prior to development over the last 150 years wasn't forest at all. There was very little forest. There was forest in the wetlands, some of the wetlands, like cypress swamps, but even flatwoods, which are wetlands by any but legal definition, were very open canopied with grasses between spaced out trees and so forth. And so my work is on ecosystem conservation and restoration. So in the tropics, I do work in forests, with a little work in woodlands and savannas, but here I'm mostly focused on restoring pine savannas, and the hydrological side of that is one of the co-benefits of reducing tree densities. So, people talk about the need to conserve forests, and I'm all in favor of that, but sometimes they promote trees at the expense of biological diversity, which is my main goal. The hydrological benefits are secondary benefits, rather than the primary objective of my interventions.
Kind of discuss that point a little bit more. So you're saying that the emphasis in Florida, at least in Florida, in conservation is the growth of forests, but that's been at the expense of diversity. How do we find that middle point then? Is it possible?
Well, I mean, the southeastern coastal plains was declared a couple of years ago as the 37th global biodiversity hotspot, because of the extraordinary diversity. But that diversity is of understory plants. It's not of trees. I mean, we have pretty high tree diversity, but nothing compared to the ground story in savannas. In those savannas, we've lost 97% of them. Only 3% remains, and a lot of those are not in very good shape due to fire suppression. And and that's the principal cause. I mean, there are other places where drainage, screwed up hydrology and pollution have been problems, but the principal problem is that the savannas have been allowed to be invaded by trees that wouldn't be there under historical or natural conditions, and they convert the savannas into forests. And the forests have much lower diversity than the plant diversity and animal diversity than the savannas that they replace. So there are a few tree species that can grow over a wide range of conditions, and they tend to dominate. Whereas in a savanna, you have hundreds of species that occupy very small areas and coexist. But with fire suppression, they disappear.
So describe why the loss of those pine savannas is problematic. So by altering the historic profile, what are we missing?
Well, I mean, to start with, we're losing the native plant and animal species that have been here since there was a here to be, right? Florida is a pretty young bit of real estate, about 5 million years old, but over those 5 million years here and in other parts of the coastal plain, these exceedingly rich savannas developed with, a flora and fauna that was unique, most of them endemic to this area. And those savannas were kept open by fires every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. And, some Westerners, when they came, they did everything they could to stop those fires at the great cost to biological diversity. But there's also other costs. When you have an open canopied savanna, an ecosystem that doesn't have trees abutting each other, you get a lot more rain coming to the ground, and you get a lot more infiltration. In fact, it's probably, the estimates are 30 to 40% more water going into the aquifer if you have a savanna than if you have a forest or a plantation. So the timber companies have converted savannas into dense plantations of slash pine and loblolly pine, and those too are starving the aquifer of water. So when you talk about problems with springs and spring eutrophication of springs and the die off of the spring biota, part of the problems is what we're doing to the upland ecosystems, that there's less water coming into the springs because we're pumping it out to water lawns and for domestic purposes. But also there's less water going in because of allowing these open canopy ecosystems to be replaced by forests or plantations.
So you mentioned how the change in tree species allow what specific species within pine savanna allow for this groundwater filtration, right? So in a normal forest, you have a lot of you have a lot of overstory that stops water from reaching the ground, like you mentioned. Are there any specific species within pine savanna that might promote the proliferation? So do fires give it does the spread of fire allow water to reach the ground more easier? Is that the way it works?
Yeah, there's less water that reaches the ground in a forest because you have multi-layers of leaves, before you get to the ground. An average forest will have 7 or 8 square meters of leaf per square meter of ground. So that's a lot of leaves to get through. But remember that all those leaves are sucking water out of the ground and putting it back in the atmosphere. Transpiration losses are huge. So not only is there less water going into the soil, there's more water coming out of the soil. Whereas if you have an open canopied ecosystem, more water gets to the ground and there's less leaf area taking that water out. And there's no species that's responsible for that. It's all structural. If you just have a lot of leaves, you're going to have this problem with starving the aquifer of water. And, so I know your focus is on water. And that's one of the benefits of restoring pine savannas and keeping the canopy open.
Yeah, so like we discussed in class, oak leaves, a lot wider, right? They burn a lot slower than compared to pine leaves, right? Does the shape of pine leaves allow water filtration to happen at a rapider rate? Because it seems like these oak leaves, right, or these kind of larger kind of trees have a more flat shape, which may seem like they carpet the ground a little bit worse.
Yeah, I think the broadleaf trap more water. They certainly need to use more water to stay cool because that boundary layer resistance means that they heat up. So they're sucking way more water out of the ground to keep from overheating than pines. But it's just because there are way more of them. I mean, a plantation of pines can be as bad as a broadleaf forest because you just have so many trees crammed into a small area. Each of those trees has a pretty substantial leaf area, and that leaf area is intercepting water and transpiring water. So it's less coming in and more going out.
And you kind of mentioned the effect of climate, right, as a result of that. So all this water is kind of going up, right? So how does the change from pine savanna to kind of more broadleaf forest affect the climate and therefore affect the rainfall that this area receives?
Well, I think that's a very important question in large continental areas like in the Amazon, where deforestation is changing rainfall regimes because there's less water going back to the atmosphere, and so there's less rain. But here in peninsular Florida, our situation is different because we're 100 kilometers from water bodies on each coast, and most of our rain is not transpirational water, which is the case in the Amazon. It's water coming from the oceans or the Gulf. I mean, in the Amazon, by the time you get to Western Brazil, a molecule of water has gone through 4 or 5 trees. It came off the ocean, it went into the ground, it got sucked out by a tree back to the atmosphere, moved more to the west and did it again and again and again. So that water molecule is getting recycled. And so when you cut the forest down, you stop that process. But here, that's less of an issue because of the proximity to the Gulf and the Atlantic.
Interesting. And then, so kind of speak a little bit more broadly on that kind of on the experience you've kind of done throughout the world. So, what general trends have you been noticing as a result of your research with water scarcity? What similarities do you see happening in Florida?
Well, we're seeing what the climate change models predicted we'd see, which is an increasing variation in everything. We have more droughts that are more severe. We have more heavy rains that are heavier, and so seeing there was always variation in temperature and rainfall, but now the variation has gotten out of hand. Florida has warmed by a 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 25 years. It's having an effect on comfort of living here, certainly, but also on ecosystem and hydrological processes. I mean, there's more evaporation. That's an exponential relationship between the water holding capacity of air and the temperature. So as temperature rises, air can hold more water and it's sucking more water out and it's getting drier. But then, we're not seeing a huge effect on total amount of rainfall. But what we are seeing is that the rain is coming in these massive storms where they drop 10 centimeters of rain in 24 hours. And that has a very different effect on plants and ecosystems than a centimeter a day for 10 days. So the water, you get a lot more runoff. We have a lot of impervious surfaces now from paving and houses and so forth. So the water is running off the surface of the land. We have ditching and draining of wetlands, so we're not storing as much water in the land. And so it's, overall, it's making us more droughty than we were historically. I mean, there were always droughts, but now we can expect them to get more severe. And you're seeing that all over the world. And what's sad is that the US, Europe, China, India are the drivers of this phenomenon globally, right? The developed nations that are using a lot of energy and causing climate change. But the people who are suffering from it are the ones who are least able to suffer from it. So, and we're doing virtually nothing to counter that. We keep making promises and keep trying things, but it's politically inexpedient to expect people to consume less. But what alarms me on the waterfront is that there are things that we could do that would not diminish our quality of life and would diminish the water that we waste. And my favorite of those options is irrigated lawns. I mean, I can't believe that we're irrigating lawns and irrigating turf grass. And, turf grass is the #1 crop in Florida based on area. It's way bigger than citrus. So huge areas of irrigated land for growing turf grass that then pulled up and used as sod, not to mention all the lawns around houses and golf courses and shopping malls and so forth. And all of that is not contributing to our welfare. It's doing the opposite. And yet, for cultural reasons, it's something that people want. And, this is America. I can do whatever the hell I want and don't try and stop me, even though you're doing social harm and environmental harm. So, but as a biological scientist, it's really humbling to realize how little I understand about human behavior and how it changes. I mean, I just was walking down the street in a town just on Saturday, and there was a lawn, a chem lawn, and it had a picture of a frog, a smiling frog, saying, "Don't touch this lawn because it's toxic." And those people spend $300-400 a month making their lawn into a Superfund site. Then they irrigate it, and your water runs onto the sidewalk and the road, and they irrigate it in the rain. And, it's just completely wasteful and damaging. And the amphibians are the ones that suffer the most from all those toxins we all suffer, but they suffer disproportionately. And estrogen mimicking compounds and, just really bad stuff that's banned. And lots of Europe wouldn't let you use that stuff. It's illegal. But there they are doing that. And it's not what would cause that homeowner to change his behavior. It's not information. It's not saying this compound that they're applying to your lawn is causing frogs to have high mutation rates. You'd say, well, yeah, but I want a green lawn. The hell with the frogs. Or he might understand that and then just do nothing about it. Well, I leave that up to the company, and they assure me, and that's the other thing, that now in this time of contesting science with ignorance and bias. I mean, it's, oh yeah, but the company said that was fake research, fake news. It doesn't cause that. You can drink it. Malathion doesn't cause, isn't toxic, and it's just all those things. And so the amount of lawn, I don't think, has diminished. And the companies that do lawn care are as common as they were before we realized just how bad this stuff was. And so, I mean, that's why leaving these campaigns to make better use of the water resources that we have, leaving those campaigns to biophysical scientists like me is crazy. It's not going to work, and it hasn't worked. We need, the behavioral scientists, we need the journalists, we need the humanists, the ones who are writing novels and short stories and poetry and making movies and changing, because we're trying to change the culture. And I can supply the information, and I can, do a research project that shows that this is bad for the environment, but that doesn't cause people to back off what they're doing. And for that, we need more of this multidisciplinary approaches.
So, it appears that a lot of the kind of culture surrounding kind of lawn usage, right, is kind of promoted by these kind of real estate corporations, right? It's a lot cheaper to install certain types of irrigation as opposed to promoting, other kind of methods. I mean, do you think there needs to be more of an emphasis from water activists and from, other people concerned with water quality on these real estate people, on these people that are responsible for promoting this culture of, the American lawn?
Yeah, I mean, some of the more enlightened developers are trying. I mean, I really think they are trying, but homeowners associations are dominated by people whose value systems do not resemble mine. That they have a picture of what they want their houses to look like, and the chem lawn is very much a part of that. And I'm using chem lawn, I mean, as an example. I mean, those are expensive. They're the xeriscaping native landscaping options are much less expensive. So that's not the point. Water is expensive. Water pumping has a big carbon footprint. All these toxins that are using in fertilizers going into the aquifer and the springs and the near shore and the red tides and all that. Getting people off this crazy American lawn story would not stop red tides from happening, but it's contributing. And it's contributing in a way that's not helping anything else. It's not growing vegetables, or it's not growing blueberries. I mean, take blueberries. Everybody loves blueberries, but blueberry fields, they fertilize too much. There's leaching from blueberry fields, and those farmers, there need to be more controls on what they're doing. And they're using overhead irrigation instead of drip irrigation, so they're using more water than they need to. Their water use is not regulated. They can take as much water from the aquifer as they want. They pay the pump, but they don't pay for the water. But we can't, because we're so opposed to regulation, we can't stop that, and the lobbies are too strong to stop that. But at least blueberries you can eat. A chem lawn you can't even touch because it's toxic. So, and the public drives. I mean, there are organic blueberry farms around, and so because people want it, and strawberries as well. It's harder to grow strawberries organically, but you can do it. And people are willing to spend somewhat more, or they're willing to pick a farm that has organic strawberries. so that's putting pressure on the industry. But boy, the lobby from Scott Chemical Company and the lawn care companies it's just so strong that it's hard to push on them. We keep trying, but it's slow.
You mentioned this kind of this overutilization of pesticides and and chemicals, right, by farmers, and but a lot of these farmers get their nutrient loads, right, as a direct result of IFAS and EDIS and a lot of the stuff the university does. I mean, why is there a discrepancy? I mean, are we giving is the university giving them the wrong numbers? I mean, what's happening there?
Well, it's interesting. IFAS is completely almost schizophrenic. I mean, there are people in IFAS who are working on alternatives to chemlawns, and there are people in IFAS that are, funded by the chemical companies and, trying to figure out how to make your lawn grow better, be greener, how to kill weeds that you and I would call biodiversity. And so they're responding to what the Florida taxpayers want, so yeah, they get their funding from industry, but it's not that they're doing it only for the industry, because people want that. They want to know, what's the newest herbicide? How do I control dollarweed in my lawn? Because it's embarrassing to have dollarweed in your lawn. I can't understand that, but apparently that's the case. So those people who are working on, on new herbicides or fertilizer regimes for chemlawns, they're not evil, and they don't want to cause eutrophication, but they're under a lot of pressure to, keep lawns green all year long, and that's a problem. So yeah, if you use the recommended practices by IFAS, my God, it's awful still. But if you do less than that, you're going to have a lawn that's brown more of the time, or has brown patches, or has dollarweed. How embarrassing to have more than an exotic turf grass have any other species. I really don't understand why more people don't have astroturf, that looks like grass, and it doesn't take all the chemicals.
And I guess that's what the trade-off, that I think a lot of people kind of struggle with, right? This idea of, having brown grass, right, or having, turf grass. So, it's a weird position because, I think if we kind of give people one option of like saying, hey, like if you don't use Bermuda grass, if you don't use all this type of stuff, you'll still have a good-looking lawn. I think more people might be a little bit more. I think people might find that a bit more approachable. But I think people find this idea of either using turf grass or having a bad lawn, it's a kind of a dichotomy that they kind of view in their heads.
Well, I mean, there is a movement called the lazy lawn mower movement, where people mow their lawn less frequently. They let it get up to, a couple inches high before they mow it. And they're not using all these herbicides to kill broadleaf species. So if you go into neighborhoods now, around Gainesville, you'll see a diversity. I mean, there are a lot of lawns, but when you look more carefully, some lawns are chem lawns, and they're being irrigated and herbicided and fertilized. And some lawns are just mown meadows. I mean, that we found just on the slopes of around Bartram Carr Hall in the museum, we found 53 species of plants, because these lawns are mown regularly, but nobody's spraying them with herbicides or fertilizing them. They do irrigate, and they irrigate with sewage water, so it does have nutrients in it, but they're not great lawns from a chemical company perspective, but they have diversity. I mean, if they mowed less often, there'd be more flowers and more pollinators and so forth, but it's better than it might be.
So yeah, I kind of want to circle back about kind of what you mentioned about this kind of climate regime change that you mentioned earlier. It seems almost a bit oxymoronic. You mentioned that things are getting the drought's going to appear more frequently, but when we do get rain, it's going to come in these rather big buckets instead of these kind of more sprinkles.
Yep.
This got like discuss the implications of that a little bit more.
Well, I mean, we just have to adapt to extreme events. I mean, it's interesting that we used to have like floods, like the 100-year flood. In fact, that's a technical term for the 100-year flood line to demarcate where wetlands are. Well, now we tend to have 100-year floods at decadal intervals, and we have the 10-year flood happening every other year. And so we're bringing this on ourselves. The problem is that you and I are contributing to this problem, and suffering the consequences. But if you and I stop, using so much water, or we give away cars, or whatever it is, the effect is going to be not measurable, and the benefit is not going to be realized by us. It's going to be realized by society in general. So, and it's going to be realized by people who continue to pollute and continue to produce a lot of carbon in the atmosphere and so forth. So it's a shared benefit, and so it's very hard to get people to personally change their practices for the good of society. It's in some cultures that's more accepted than in ours, and in ours it's more accepted in some subcultures than others. But right now the Republican run government is not going to cause regulation or allow regulations to happen that restrict our freedoms in any way, in the name of freedom, so that individuals have more freedom, but society in general suffers. I mean, you can deal with that on any of a wide range of topics. Gun control. I mean, they're trying to get rid of background checks because it interferes. Like, I'm pissed off, I want to go buy a gun. I don't want to wait 3 days. This is America. I should be able to buy a gun right now. And actually, I can right now. There's a gun show happening within 30 miles of here, and I can go in without any background checks and I can buy a gun. And I mean, that's terrible for society, right? And the data show that, but it's a God-given right to carry a gun. I mean, it's just like, so it's a God-given right to be able to irrigate your lawn. And so trying to fight that is hard. And we look at socialism has such a bad name in this country, which is curious because a lot of the people who hate socialism weren't around when, the USSR was a travesty. It was hardly a socialist. It was a totalitarian regime. And the big socialist countries in the world have some of the highest standards of living and the highest quality of living as judged by happiness indices, the Scandinavian countries, where people pay 55% taxes, but, they have childcare, good schools, free universities, people aren't in debt, they have medical care that's not insane. People don't work in order to have medical care. Medical care is considered a right, not a privilege, and that's not the case in this country. And yet we anything that looks socialist is an anathema. So Bernie Sanders was, said he was a socialist, and that probably, among other things, killed his candidacy because people hate socialists. Well, you have countries that are called socialist, which are totalitarian and kleptocracies, Venezuela and Cuba, really poorly governed, a lot of corruption. Those aren't socialist nations. They have elements of socialism, as do we, like public libraries, Social Security,
Public universities.
public universities. Yeah, I mean, we like those things, but don't call it socialism.
I think, especially, I think the term regulation is kind of a dirty word, right? And I think it is also fair to say that there's good regulations and there's bad regulations, right? And that applies to the environment as well, right? So, kind of discuss this idea. I mean, you know, because just because you're regulating an environmental factor, or regulating something that has to do with the environment, that doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing either. I mean, I do think there are examples of bad environmental regulations, right?
Yeah, there are bad regulations. There are bad enforcement mechanisms. There are inefficiencies all along the line. I mean, one in the forest industry, forestry industries in Florida and all through the U.S., they negotiated with the government and said that we will police ourselves. We will set our own regulations and we will enforce them. And if you're not satisfied with what we're doing in kind of regulating ourselves, then you can step in. So they have what are called best management practices. And the Florida forest industries have about 97% compliance with their best management practices. And the best management practices are revised every 10 years. And the people responsible for those BMPs, they're called, is representatives from the government, from industry, and from environmental groups. And so they negotiate all this. But the regulation, the reason there's 97% compliance is that the regulations hardly change business as usual practices. So they're too weak. The bar is way too low. So, the one related to forests is that it's perfectly okay, according to the best management practices for silviculture, to go into a cypress dome. You know what that is, like out at Morningside. Go into a cypress dome, clear cut it, take the trunks of the trees and grind them up into mulch for landscaping, and walk away. In the process, you convert a cypress-dominated swamp with trees into a herbaceous marsh, into a shrub marsh, into deep water, because where the machines go, they have floating aquatics and then later emergent aquatics. You entirely destroy the ecosystem, and that's okay according to the BMPs, as long as there's not a creek somewhere where you're putting sediment into that creek. And how can that be right? But yeah, I mean, it's a negotiation. And, I, at one point, 30 or 40 years ago, I was on the verge of being one of the environmentalists that was going to be negotiating on these BMPs, but I was not allowed to do that because I was seen as too radical. So the environmentalists that are there, they're negotiators. They are indeed environmentalists, but they're willing to put up with a lot more than I would. And in fact, I wouldn't have been effective because I would have been so annoyed that I probably would have just boycotted it. Because, the use of chemicals, the use of massive clear cuts, the conversion of one ecosystem into another, driven by the profit motive. And a lot of these forest owning companies are really developers waiting for the land prices to go up. So it would have been a very difficult role to play to try to be reasonable and to find common ground in that situation. But what they say is, if the government regulates us, okay, let's say we have to change a practice. And we, the industry, realize that we need to change the practice. Okay, fine. It costs us something. If the government comes in and says we have to change that same practice, the cost of changing doubles. So dealing with the government is exceedingly costly. So you want to do anything you can to avoid having to deal with government regulations because they cost you money. And they cost you money because some unavoidable costs of bureaucracy, of administration, of record keeping and all that. And they also cost you money because government employees are different than private sector employees on average. There's, a lot of overlap, but government employees don't tend to work as hard. They don't tend to be as efficient. They're not driven by the profit motive. What they get at the end of the week or the month or the year does not depend on how much work they did, how much timber they harvested. It's just, did they go to work? And they see that and they get annoyed by it. And so it really frustrates them even more because some they think overpaid governmental bureaucrat comes out to inspect their forest or their building site or whatever. And, here we are working our butts off with calluses on our hands. And this guy comes up in a air-conditioned car, government car. He's working 35 hours a week or whatever. We're working 60 out in the hot sun, and he's telling us that we can't do this? No. So that's hard to get around. I mean, that is just the cost of government. A government job is not super well paid, but it's very secure. It's very hard to get rid of government employees.
It appears that there's a difference in culture, and
that's a cultural difference. Yep.
And that's something that's incredibly hard to kind of get over. And I mean, but that's what the point of projects like this is to kind of understand where everybody's positionality is, because there has to be some nexus that exists between these different stakeholders.
I agree.
And I think you brought up an interesting point earlier. This idea that you as an environmentalist, would be too hard pressed, simply, really based upon principle, to be one of those negotiators at one of those, things. I mean, I think a lot of people in the environmental kind of field can definitely empathize with that. I mean, but to me, it's such a conundrum because, if we're not going to be at the table, right? I mean, things, sacrifices that we deem unacceptable are going to happen, but at the same time, I value principle and value and morality, above anything else. So how do you manage that? I mean, are some people just better working in between lines than others? I mean, because that never justifies the means. At least it doesn't to me. You mean?
No, but you have to pick your battles too. I mean, I've been doing this for 50 years, and I do it every day, every year. And I continue to do it because I haven't burned myself out by getting into roles where I would feel completely just frustrated. And so I battle all the time with people that I think I can, be effective, but I don't do it where I think I'm going to fail. Hang on a second.
So kind of just to get us back on track, the last thing we were discussing was, you picking your battles as a result of kind of how frustrating things can get. You've been doing it for 50 years, you were mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, my principal work is trying to improve tropical forest management. So my negotiations are with tropical forest companies, which aren't the easiest ones in the world to negotiate with, but I've built up some credibility over the years, and so I can try. I think they trust me enough to talk with me about possibilities of doing things differently that are not going to cost them their jobs, or their companies. So
I mean, for the average person, like me, or for kind of just other environmental activists, what can we do, or what needs to be done, in order to kind of open up those conversations, that are a little bit harder to have, especially with the people like you kind of mentioned that are in power.
Well, I mean, I think you can answer your own question because you and others took on the administration when it came to McCarty Woods. And that's just one way of doing things. There are others. There's writing, there's talking, there's outreach, there are other things that you can do. It's not only confrontation, but one of the problems environmentalists have is that they don't participate in the process right along. So like every county commission meeting and city commission meeting, it's once a week for 3 or 4 hours, there are developers and realtors who are there just monitoring what's going on and speaking up when something looks like it's going to go badly for them. And there aren't environmentalists doing that. And so when a new development that's really kind of environmentally disastrous comes along, environmentalists don't even hear about it until it's already gotten preliminary approvals and gotten this paperwork and that paperwork, and then we go, oh my God. And sometimes it's totally in the open. Sometimes it's hidden purposefully, but a lot of times it's just in the open and people aren't monitoring, So how far along did the toll road proposal get before people started screaming about it? And it was backroom kind of, I own this land, you own that. I'm going to buy that land because that's where the road's going to go. And all this scratch my back, I'll scratch yours will change the voting districts and give you, a bigger slice of, rich white people votes or whatever it is. And, all these shenanigans. And then we have a problem because it's, gotten a lot of approvals and so I think we need to be more involved all along, but that's hard to do. I mean, how much do you do that? I mean, some people are better at that than others. And I can't sit through 3-hour commission meetings with people talking drivel. I just, I have other things that I think I can do more effectively. It's just continuing to try and not burning yourself out so you stop trying and then take up golf or something, just because you can't face it anymore. And I see that with a lot of people, that they just get passionate about something and they work really hard on it. They may succeed or they may fail, and then that's it. They're not going to do anything more, and so they're no longer part of the solution. That expression, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And that's very much the case. But activism is hard to sustain for long periods. And activists have, their costs to it. It depends how, and some people are better at it than others. Some people are smoother or some people are more empathetic, or they're just more effective at it than others. But there are roles for everyone. But the problem is that they're activists on both sides. They're gun rights activists, they're anti-abortion activists, and they really believe that stuff. They really believe that a woman shouldn't have the right to her own body. And so it's not that it's just a completely different perspective. And so you have to respect it. And yet, it's not, and I would hope for democracy, and I hope that more people are working because of gerrymandering of voting districts, we no longer have a representative democracy. There are many, many issues that are unpopular in terms of the public that still are made into law because of bad government.
And I think you bring up a good point, right? Because if you look at environmental issues, I mean, you know, issue by issue, environmental issues have almost, have a large degree of support. I mean, margins of 60, 70, 80, 90%, right?
Yep.
Issue by issue. And it's fascinating because it's like if you look at the larger political agenda, I mean, we're not seeing the same numbers kind of line. So there's definitely a very distinct, miscalculation between what the people want and what our voting records are saying and what's happening at larger levels.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just think that's a fascinating point.
Well, and it has to do with very smart people gaming the system, cheating the system. So what did they just gerrymandered out two African American Senate seats in the Florida Senate just by changing the districts. They made it so that these African Americans lose their position. They're already underrepresented in terms of the population, but so it's working at that level as well. So finding people who are informed about it and passionate about it and willing to work on it, and we need that as well.
And I guess the final question I kind of have, is to anybody that's listening, right, to any of the audience, what kind of final thoughts do you have about kind of the issues we've been talking about?
Well, I mean, informing yourself is the first step, and then acting on what you know. Being responsible, and that's going to help. And if more people did that, I think the world would be in a lot better position. But it's also admitting that it's not easy, and none of these fixes are going to be instantaneous or easy.
Fantastic. Well, I guess that concludes the interview.